Help! I wrecked my tank. First off, no you didn't. I know Aiptasia are a bit of a pain, or let's face it, a huge pain, especially if they get out of control. I mean, look at how many reefers are still dealing with this pest on a regular basis. It sucks. However, there are lots of ways that we can solve an Aiptasia issue. But before we get into all of that, what is Aiptasia? They are a small and very prolific anemone known to take over quickly and irritate, damage, and even kill corals. They, just like corals, have symbiotic algae that are photosynthetic, plus they very aggressively consume meaty foods as well, whether that is plankton in the water or excess food that lands on them when you're feeding. They are incredibly hardy, resilient, and essentially do all the same things corals do, just better, faster, stronger, which is why they can take over a reef tank so easily. That, and the fact that they can reproduce both sexually and asexually at a very rapid pace. And don't feel too badly about having Aiptasia. They are really easy to add to your aquarium by accident. And yes, you did hear me right, you added them to your aquarium, albeit by accident. So before we talk about how we can treat the Aiptasia that you've already got and get rid of them, let's talk about how you can actually prevent putting them in your tank in the first place. So where does Aiptasia come from? It comes from another system that already has Aiptasia. So that means live rock from a store or another hobbyist, or live sand that's transferred from another aquarium. Water from another system. Yes, they can be free floating, and usually when they're still super tiny, so they're hard to see. Macroalgae like Chaetomorpha is notorious for having Aiptasia and other pests. And super commonly, it's found on coral bases, skeletons, and frag plugs or discs, which is most likely how the vast majority of reefers are getting Aiptasia into their tanks. Now, I'm willing to bet that at least one of those things sounded super familiar to you, but no worries. Once you identify the likely culprit, you can then take action to avoid that problem and basically take an alternative route. So how do you avoid getting Aiptasia via those particular methods? You can use dry rock or pest-free live rock sources. Make sure not to use sand from other systems. Do not allow water from another system into yours, i.e. don't let the water in the bag get into your tank with that new coral or invert. Dip all corals in frags, remove plugs by cutting them off the coral whenever possible. Inspect each coral closely and treat any Aiptasia found immediately, and even better, quarantine that coral for a few weeks to make sure that the Aiptasia was in fact effectively killed before moving it into your reef system. And you can add an Aiptasia-eating filefish to your aquarium before you begin adding corals, or now if you don't already have one. They're very easy to care for, they're interesting to watch, and they're just a great little fish either way. And that's all well and good. You should definitely start doing those things if you haven't yet, but you're here because you already have a problem. So what do you do to actually tackle an Aiptasia issue? There are essentially two different ways to approach tackling an Aiptasia infestation: natural predators as well as physical treatments and removal. If you've only got a handful of Aiptasia popping up, some quick physical treatments to kill or remove them are a great route to take. But if you've got a lot of Aiptasia in there, pairing that up with a natural predator is going to be a lot more effective. So what are your options for natural predators? First, Bergia nudibranchs. These are by far the most effective at eradicating Aiptasia entirely. These little nudies eat Aiptasia exclusively, and what's even better is that they will reproduce in your system, increasing their numbers to scale with the size of your Aiptasia outbreak. You'll want to start with at least 8 Bergia just to make sure you get enough to get that population going, which can be a little bit pricey at roughly $15 per nudibranch. It can also take a few weeks before you start seeing real progress and upwards of months for them to completely eradicate a bad infestation, but they will find and eliminate every Aiptasia in the aquarium since that's their only source of food. These little nudies are nocturnal and do their work at night and stay hidden during the day, so if you want to see them in action, you'll need a flashlight. This is actually a good thing since some fish like to eat nudibranchs and flatworms, and those fish tend to be diurnal and active during the day while the nudibranchs are asleep. Once all of the Aiptasia is gone, unless you set up a separate Aiptasia farm to keep those nudibranchs fed, they will eventually all perish. The good news is they're highly sought after, so you should have no trouble finding another local reefer who could benefit from some Bergia. It is worth mentioning Bergia don't always do the best in really high flow tanks unless you turn the pumps down in the evening when the lights are out. Speaking of which, it is the safest to add them to your tank in the evening when your lights are off and all the fish and other reef critters are already hiding for the night. That way they can settle in peacefully and have the greatest chance of success. Another great option is that Aiptasia eating filefish that I was mentioning earlier. They can be very productive at picking off Aiptasia and keeping them under control. While they might not eradicate them entirely, they can keep them at bay to the point where you might not even be able to actually see any Aiptasia, which is certainly enough to keep them from being a problem for your corals. These filefish are also easy to get onto other prepared foods, so you don't need to worry about them starving once the Aiptasia are all taken care of. Unfortunately, not every one of these filefish will take to picking off the Aiptasia right away, and sometimes it takes them weeks to gain the appetite for them. So it might mean that you're waiting a little while before you start to see those results. I have also seen them pick at corals that have little clear feeding tentacles that resemble Aiptasia, and while they don't usually do any actual damage, if they pick on the same coral often, it can mean that that coral doesn't show its feeding tentacles until nighttime. There are some other natural predators that reefers often try, like peppermint shrimp and copperband butterfly fish, but both of these options are hit and miss for different reasons. Peppermints don't love high flow, they can also pick on corals at times, and not all peppermint species will actually eat Aiptasia. Copperbands in general are just not an easy fish and not a great choice for most reefers. They have a poor survival rate in general, so I tend to steer people away from them as an Aiptasia solution, especially since they also eat feather dusters and other kinds of sessile invertebrates that you might not want them to. Personally, I will always go the natural route in conjunction with physical treatments and removal, but before I dive into some of those methods, there is something you're going to need to know about. You remember how I was saying that these Aiptasia can reproduce asexually? Aiptasia are actually capable of cloning themselves using just a single healthy cell. Wild, I know. That means if you scrape one off your glass and even one living cell is left behind, it could potentially regrow another entire Aiptasia in its place from that one cell. Another issue is that Aiptasia reproduce when they're stressed out. So if you damage an Aiptasia or stress it out enough, that's just going to fuel more Aiptasia. It's like the mythical Hydra. You cut off one head and 3 grow in its place. All of this to say, if you're going to use physical treatments to kill or remove Aiptasia, you have to use treatments that are known to work 100% of the time, and you've got to be thorough. So what are your options? Well, the best option that I've used is very specifically Frank's f-aiptasia. This is a topical paste that you use a syringe to apply over top of the Aiptasia, covering it up entirely. This paste then hardens, trapping and killing the Aiptasia. You can then break it apart after a week or so if you want to get rid of the hardened paste, but it is ultimately harmless if left in the tank, and it'll just grow coralline over top of it if you leave it alone. It isn't perfect though. It doesn't work very well on completely horizontal surfaces or for Aiptasia that are up underneath a rock or a coral, only the ones that you can apply it to top down. In those cases, you can do something similar by covering the Aiptasia in super glue gel and then applying a reef-safe epoxy putty like coral gum to permanently cover and kill the Aiptasia. Those are the 2 surefire ways that I know of to kill Aiptasia yourself. Now, you might see some other interesting or tempting options out there, like gadgets, for instance. 2 that come to mind are the Reef Delete and the Majano wand. While they do look tempting, the truth is they aren't as effective as I'd like them to be, especially for the price tag, and they're not at all what I would consider a permanently effective solution, especially since Aiptasia can grow back from just a single healthy cell. So save your money and stick to tried and true methods that work for everyone, even if it means a little bit more elbow grease. Now, there is also physical removal, but again, to some degree, this is playing with fire. That being said, the best scenario for physically removing Aiptasia is when they're stuck to your glass or on the substrate. Using a siphon and a scraper blade, you can simultaneously scrape the Aiptasia off the glass while sucking it directly out of the tank with the siphon. The chances of anything being left behind are pretty low if you do it right. And when they're on the substrate, you can literally just suck that substrate directly out of the tank with the siphon and call it a day. Sure, you might need to add a bit of substrate back to the tank after, but it's well worth the cost of not having to deal with that Aiptasia potentially growing and replicating. And while I hate to bring it up, your display tank might not be the only place those Aiptasia have been growing. It is very common for them to also end up all over your sump, your filtration gear, your refugium, basically everywhere that there's water. The good news is it is really easy to deal with them there. Chuck all of your macroalgae and replace it with clean macroalgae, drain your sump completely, clean it all out with fresh water. You can even decalcify it at the same time with some citric acid, your skimmer and your other gear too while you're at it. And when you're all done, it will be completely Aiptasia free. So that's the good news. I know that was a lot of info, but if you follow it and keep up with it, even if it doesn't happen very quickly, you will be able to get ahead of those dastardly Aiptasia. And natural solutions like Bergia are a fantastic way to completely eradicate Aiptasia. But again, it may take a few months for them to complete their job, and then they'll slowly starve, meaning you'll be left vulnerable thereafter, making those preventative measures I talked about at the beginning all the more important. And Aiptasia might not be the only pest you face on your reefing journey. And if you want to make sure that you can get ahead of all of those other pests and deal with them effectively, you can check out the videos in this playlist, just like this one, that are going to help guide you through that process and make sure that your reefing journey is a pleasant one. Check it out.